Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week we approach the end and we finally get some answers in chapters 36 to 50 of Great Expectations, in which Pip gets even more tangled in the threads of his life. He's reunited with the convict from the marshes, he learns of the provenance of his newfound fortune, Estella is married, Miss Havisham is consumed by fire, and the least plausible twist of the entire novel is delivered by Herbert. Lots to cover then, before we move into our discussion of both the original and the revised endings of the book in next week's episode. Let's get started. We open this week's reading then with chapter 36 and Pip's 21st birthday. We get an extended sequence of Jaggers at his most courtroom combative, and the upshot is that Pip is given £500 and the promise of 125 more each quarter until his mysterious benefactor becomes known to him. That £500 has a current value of about $20,000, although its buying power would have been inarguably much higher. There's a lovely ambiguity here in Dickens' writing. Jaggers is largely a comedic figure during our first trip through this scene. He's pedantic, he's repetitive, and his specificity leaves Pip rather charmingly befuddled. But once the identity of the secret benefactor is revealed, a lot of Jaggers' formal caginess is reframed as a close desire to remain separate and distinct from what he already knows to be an illegal act, a dangerous act, and an act which could harm his business and reputation, his influence in London, if he isn't painstakingly adherent to the letter of the law. This is a necessary part of strong mystery writing, though whether or not Great Expectations is a strong mystery remains somewhat open to debate and your own personal take on the book. Doing something right in front of the reader, which is assumed to be superficial, only to later reveal that it had another layer to it, another interpretation just waiting for the right lens, the right perspective, the right interpretive strategy. That's how you build out the world of the mystery. You make it feel more organic, more coherent. You do the close-up magic right in front of the reader. The most successful modern form of this strategy is, I think, undoubtedly Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, in which a midpoint reveal suddenly and completely transforms the first half of the book. Everything that you read up to that point is suddenly inverted, and you get this cascade of reinterpretation and reintegration. New understanding flows over you. It is a knockout piece of writing that I'm not going to spoil here, because if you've read Gone Girl, then you'll obviously know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't, particularly if you don't know what the twist is or to whom it relates, then you absolutely should. This is also the point at which Pip embarks on a financially imprudent but extremely generous plan to provide for his friend Herbert. Wemmick blows him off because the Wemmick of the office cannot countenance the investment of large sums of money in the well-being of a friend, but we'll continue to work through this plot across the entirety of this week's reading, actually, and it's worth flagging right now, I think, as one of the most interesting and subtle pieces of Pip's arc, and of the thematic structure of the book, because in effect, Pip is extending the same generosity and largesse that was first extended to him by his benefactor. He is secretly pulling the strings to provide a better life for Herbert, though here, you'll note, somewhat daunted by his memory of his debts and by Wemmick's attitude, he softens that desire, saying that he wants to invest money down with some expectations of recompense in the future. That is not how this plot will eventually work out. In the next chapter, we visit the castle in Woolworth, spending some time with the aged parent, and though I'm usually skeptical of this kind of interpretation, because it's stepping on thin ice to presume that we know too well the mind of the author, I can't help but wonder if this scene is a gift to a contemporary audience which had already expressed a great deal of affection for the aged P. It is certainly a charming scene, and the unfolding of the little doors indicating the arrival of Wemmick or Miss Skiffins is a particular high point. She is an excellent match of character to Jaggers' clerk, and I think that their relationship, as straightforward as it is really rather charming. Pip lays out his plan for Herbert, and Wemmick agrees to help, and Pip concludes by saying, quote, "I thank you 10,000 times. On the contrary," said he, "I thank you. For though we are strictly in our private and personal capacity, still it may be mentioned that there are Newgate cobwebs about, and it brushes them away." End quote. And even here, at the end of this light scene, we're reminded of one of the reasons Wemmick so rigidly enforces the separation between the office and the castle. And sadly, we see that even these steps are insufficient to completely banish the work of the day from his mind. I must admit, I didn't expect John Wemmick, of all characters, to rise so much in my estimation during this reading of Great Expectations, but I've honestly, candidly, never really paid that much attention to him as I've read the book in the past. But he is clearly, I think, one of the few simply good characters in the entire novel, and that's before he directly intervenes in Pip's life to help save him from danger. In time, Herbert Pocket is brought into the employ of Clarriker, an up-and-coming merchant secretly supported by Pip. Here, Pip confesses, quote, "At length the thing being done, and the day he having entered Clarriker's house, and he having talked to me for the whole evening in the flush of pleasure and success, I did really cry in good earnest when I went to bed, to think that my expectations had done some good to somebody." End quote. So this is accomplishing three things narratively. On the most superficial level, it shows the bond between Pip and Herbert to be a good, deep, and honest one, which is necessary to understand if we're to feel good about their association through the trials and the difficulties to come. Second, we're reassured about Pip's good nature, about his generosity, about his regard for others. We haven't done yet with the decline and fall of Pip Pirrip, but his restoration is coming too, and beats like this remind us that there was always a good, generous boy within him. The third, and perhaps most narratively significant element, comes in the form of the repetition itself. As I said, Pip is repeating the cycle of his own enrichment, even down to the secrecy. We are therefore seeing this mechanism from the inside. We are understanding it, because it can be presumed that the audience loves Herbert, as we all should. Understanding it to be a good and generous thing, a selfless and loving thing, sets a new expectation for how these kinds of generous and creative acts are supposed to work. This is going to be contrasted with what we see next. And all of this, of course, sets the stage, particularly for contemporary Victorian audiences, for the reveal of Pip's benefactor. I particularly love the flourish here at the end of the chapter, by the way, and the foreshadowing of the adult Pip. Anyway, I spent all this time doing comedy bits with Jaggers and Wemmick and Herbert, but that's not all I do. Quote, "A great event in my life, the turning point in my life, now opens on my view. But before I proceed to narrate it, and before I pass on all the changes it involved, I must give one chapter to Estella. It's not much to give to the theme that so long filled my heart." End quote. This, of course, marks the end of chapter 37, which was published April 27th, 1861. The next chapter, which we now know will be Estella-centric, will be published on May the 4th, 1861. Dickens, still the salesman. Pip lays out his relationship with Estella very plainly at the beginning of the chapter. They are close, they are familiar, they are to some extent intimate, but there's no affection from Estella. He is put to use. He is making her admirers envious and more fervent in their desires. Quote, "I saw her often at Richmond. I heard of her often in town, and I used often to take her and the Brandleys on the water. There were picnics, fete days, plays, operas, concerts, parties, all sorts of pleasures through which I pursued her, and they were all miseries to me. I never had 1 hour's happiness in her society, and yet my mind all round the 24 hours was harping on the happiness of having her with me unto death." End quote. But Pip is perceptive enough that he sees the cracks in the facade, these moments when at least Estella is being honest, and he sees there hope for the future, even as she explicitly tells him that there is no hope, which is a paradox which could very easily collapse into an awful modern commentary on men and women being friends, or on the toxic notion of the friend zone. Pip's great saving grace here is his continuing understanding that Estella is actually awful, and that she hurts him again and again, and that he loves her anyway. He does not seek to resolve that contradiction, that paradox, into a single, simple, sustainable emotional state. Instead, he suffers, caught between the two states of being. He doesn't narrativize her experience. He doesn't intrude on her relationship with Miss Havisham or make her story about himself. He just loves her, as hurtful as that is. Speaking of Havisham, the scene in Richmond is a prologue to the return to Satis House, where we are told nothing has changed, except perhaps that Miss Havisham is more fierce in her desire to witness Pip's torment than ever before. And I guess, in a counterpoint to what I said earlier, we get the odd note here from Pip that he understands Estella's purpose is to, quote, "wreak Miss Havisham's revenge on man, and that she was not to be given to me until she had gratified it for a term." End quote. The idea, of course, of Estella being given to Pip is an uncomfortable one. But we must remember, though this is a moment where we could really use some explicit framing from adult Pip in the narrative, we must remember that Pip still believes to some extent that Estella is a part of the package, that she is a part of his great expectations. Why else, after all, would Havisham so constantly force them to be together? What other purpose, besides the wreaking of her vengeance, could there be? But it's Estella, and not Pip, who is over it. Quote, so proud, moaned Miss Havisham, pushing away her grey hair with both her hands. "Who taught me to be proud?" returned Estella. "Who praised me when I learnt my lesson?" So hard, moaned Miss Havisham with her former action. "Who taught me to be hard?" returned Estella. "Who praised me when I learnt my lesson?" End quote. We see here Estella's obvious intelligence. Like Pip, she isn't ignorant of her circumstances, but she can't change who she is just because she understands why she is. The greatest moment of her understanding comes, a moment of calm wonder, as Pip says, when she understands that she has been both denied love and taught that it is her enemy to be defended against, that she has been taught to weaponize it in turn, to be contemptuous of it. She gets both sides of Havisham's manipulation, but she can't take the next step into breaking those chains, because she is as she has been made. Pip finally retreats from the scene, impotently gesturing to suggest that Estella take care of Miss Havisham, and then we reset to the familiar. They play cards, though now they are educated and play French games. Sleepless that night, sleeping for the first time inside his house, Pip sees Miss Havisham with a candle in the bridal chamber crying out, and we're then told that Estella never revisits the subject of her making, though they visit Miss Havisham together 4 more times. That puts an interesting time lock, too, on the ongoing relationship with Estella, on the ongoing relationship with Miss Havisham. There is this brooding sense that something is coming, that Pip's situation, for all that he seems stable, is not permanent. But we're not done yet with Estella, because now we have a new complication. Bentley Drummle, who begins by toasting Estella at a party of the Finches of the Grove. Pip effectively challenges Drummle to a duel, and the history of dueling in the late Regency and early Victorian periods is fascinating because it is absolutely illegal. It has been illegal, in fact, for a long time, since Queen Elizabeth I outlawed dueling in 1571. But it is also culturally supported and sanctioned as a means of resolving conflicts, particularly between the wealthy and the noble. Despite its illegality, a British army officer was court-martialed and discharged from service in 1814 for not dueling a fellow officer after being publicly insulted. Queen Victoria herself thought dueling was sometimes the only answer to a problem. The last fatal duel between Englishmen in England was fought in 1845, 15 years before the publication of Great Expectations, when James Alexander Seton squared off against Henry Hawke over romantic entanglements with Hawke's wife. Hawke won, and was then tried for murder, only to be roundly acquitted in the courts. So from the historical record, from the context of the time, we can see what ignites the Finches in this moment. Pip tells us that his declaration that Drummle will, quote, know where to find him, sparks 6 similar challenges as they debate the merits of the duel. They decide instead that proof is necessary, that Drummle must bring a note from Estella proving that she does, in fact, know him, and then Pip must apologize. Drummle does so, and Pip folds, which only fuels their mutual animosity still further. Pip acknowledges that he would harbor ill feelings for anyone that Estella was dancing with, but, quote, I cannot adequately express what pain it gave me to think that Estella should show any favor to a contemptible, clumsy, sulky booby so very far below the average. Now that is a Stars and Swords t-shirt idea, right? A contemptible, clumsy, sulky booby so very far below the average. I know that I would wear one in the summer season. Pip confesses his feelings to Estella, again misunderstanding the final aspect of their relationship, which Estella, at least, again makes clear. Pip complains, quote, for I have seen you give him looks and smiles this very night, such as you never give to me. Do you want me then, said Estella, turning suddenly with a fixed and serious, if not angry, look, to deceive and entrap you? Do you deceive and entrap him, Estella? Yes, and many others, all of them but you. End quote. So at least from Estella's perspective, her unguarded coldness, her unshrouded cruelty, these are gifts. These are acts of kindness. These are means of expressing intimacy with a boy that she knew growing up. Yes, it is a torment, but it is better than the torment that she visits deliberately upon her other admirers. We'll delve more deeply into how Estella works in society toward the end of today's reading. In chapter 39, Pip is now 23 years old, and he and Herbert are now living in the Temple, the area of London surrounding the Temple Church, right in the middle of the city on the northern bank of the Thames. We sketch Pip's current circumstances, most notably Herbert being absent in Marseille, and then we get deep into Gothic melodrama. Quote, it was wretched weather, stormy and wet, mud, 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 deep in all the streets. Day after day a vast heavy veil had been driving over London from the east, and it drove still, as if in the east there were an eternity of cloud and wind. So furious had been the gusts that high buildings in town had the lead stripped off their roofs, and in the country trees had been torn up, and sails of windmills carried away, and gloomy accounts had come in from the coast of shipwreck and death. Violent blasts of rain had accompanied these rages of the wind, and the day just closed as I sat down to read had been the worst of all. End quote. There are so many directions that we can go with this, and I am sure papers could be written on fully half of them. Dickens' use of the pathetic fallacy to mirror the emotional state of the protagonist in the weather, in the conditions of the world around him, the relocation of isolated Gothic horror imagery from the country to the city, the opposition of the mud and the veil of rain and the furious gusts with the heavy, still, muffling mists of the moors, the isolation that we're going to see in Pip's dark, shrouded home, particularly when he wakes in the night to find the lights extinguished, and the still timeless darkness of Satis House, of course, always present on the periphery of his mind. I'm not sure that one of these academic readings is more valuable than any of the others, and they all, while valid interpretive moves, I think, might be missing the basic stylistic point. This is accessible mass-market Victorian horror, and maybe no one does it better than Dickens. It's at 11 o'clock that Pip hears the footsteps on the stair, and for a moment he calls to mind the visions of his sister shortly after her death. But this man, muscular, around 60 years old, long grey hair, and an unquenchable enthusiasm for Pip himself, climbs the stair instead. So let's look at the beats here. First, the Gothic horror of the man himself, a working-class man of rough dress and manners, no less, invading Pip's sanctum in the very late evening. Then the sudden realization that this is the convict from the marshes. It's to Pip's credit, and an acknowledgement of the undeniable social hierarchy that is at play here, that he is both firm and generous with the spectre of the past. You'll note that his fear of the man all but dissipates when he realizes who it is, because beyond the risk of physical injury, which he seems to dismiss almost immediately, there's little that this convict can do to a man within the bounds of his own castle. Still, Pip recognizes that the man is wet and offers him hospitality. He is generous. A drink, a warm place to sit. Pip even thinks of the messenger dispatched many years ago to give him the £2 notes, the same convict he saw later in the carriage returning to Kent. The convict playfully, teasingly describes himself as a warmint, again demonstrating the working-class tendency to turn V's into W's, and though the word varmint is now almost exclusively associated with the American West, the word had been in common usage for 300 years in England prior to this period, colloquialized, of course, from the word vermin. And thus, the revelation. This is Pip's benefactor, this convict from the marshes, one Abel Magwitch by name, who made his fortune in Australia and resolved to make Pip a gentleman, partly as a thank you for the boy's kindness, of course, and partly, well, let's look at his words precisely. Quote, "It was a recompense to me, looky here, to know in secret that I was making a gentleman. The blood horses of them colonists might fling up the dust over me as I was walking. What do I say? I says to myself, I'm making a better gentleman nor ever you'll be. When one of them says to another, he was a convict a few years ago and is an ignorant common fellow now for all he's lucky. What do I say? I says to myself, if I ain't a gentleman, nor yet ain't got no learning, I'm the owner of such. All on you owns stock and land, which on you owns a brought-up London gentleman. This way I kept myself a-going." End quote. And this is absolutely critical to our understanding of the book, because so often the superficial read of Great Expectations roots Magwitch's motivations entirely in the first account that he gives, in the first version of this interpretation. But Dickens offers this much more complex perspective on his motivations, whereby his act of creation, his making of Pip's fortune, is a way of taking control of the systems of oppression, of conservation of wealth and authority, the perpetuation of this iniquitous society. Magwitch is taking ownership of something greater than stock and money and land. He's taking control. He's expressing ownership over nobility and decency and respectability. This is not to suggest that he isn't grateful to Pip, or that the boy's kindness isn't ultimately the most powerful force for good in his life, but let's remember that Pip's kindness is at least balanced and moderated by his fear of violence and of retribution. And rather, we can see clearly what Dickens unambiguously asserts. This is a kind of personal one-man class war, a way of Magwitch making sense of his own life and fortunes by seizing those mechanisms which underpin social advancement, money and education and property, and demonstrating for all to see a mastery of them, even if he can't yield directly the benefits of that mastery. And without this understanding, the entire thematic heart of the book is off balance, because what this understanding gives us is a better symmetry between Magwitch and Havisham, who creates Estella as a means of taking revenge, yes, but within that revenge is a similar desire to take control of the mechanisms that led to her own oppression, to the leveraging of beauty and grace and romantic love and sexual desire to engender jealousy and envy and rivalry and pain. There are a couple more complications connecting Magwitch and Havisham that we'll get to later in this week's reading, not all of which work terribly well, but this, I think, is the thematic core of the novel. This is the greatest and most explicit symmetry. Magwitch creates Pip. Havisham creates Estella. Our perspective can be enriched by also looking at Mrs. Joe and Belinda Pocket as mothers, as we've discussed before, and understanding that not only are they not thinking about the raising of children in the same way, this abstracted, bullying, conceptual approach to discipline from Mrs. Joe and the stark negligence that we get from Mrs. Pocket, but Havisham and Magwitch are creating with a purpose. And I mentioned in the recent bonus episode on Mike Newell's 2012 adaptation of Great Expectations, which is available now over on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword, that Newell's decision to have Pip read an excerpt from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein demonstrates that he understands this thematic aspect of the novel, though oddly the film itself leaves much of that comparison and contrast on the cutting room floor. He's evoking the idea, too, of Pip self-identifying as Victor Frankenstein later in this chapter, where he says, quote, "The imaginary student pursued by the misshapen creature he had impiously made was not more wretched than I," while he's being forced to read for the pleasure of Magwitch. An interesting inversion there of the creative principle, right? That he is being pursued by the homunculus of his own making, at least in his mind, whereas the creative relationship between he and Magwitch is, of course, very different. And of course, if we are comparing these two high-level creative acts, the act of Havisham, the act of Magwitch, then we ought to compare, I think, their creations. And this, I think, is where Dickens strays just a little from the most direct path of the plot, because Estella is raised from her earliest moment, in effect, to be what she is. She has no awareness of a life before the influence of Havisham on her personality. But Pip is already dissatisfied as a child. He is dissatisfied with his life before the coming of his good fortune, even before, we might speculate, the coming of Abel Magwitch into his life. Estella is created more thoroughly, more directly, more completely than Pip is, which is, well, that's something that we'll return to, I guess, at the end of the novel. Before we move on, though, we should take a look at the reveal itself, one of the more famous twists in all of Victorian literature, of course, that Pip is given his life as a gentleman not from Havisham, the person that he expects to be responsible and who we, because of her rank and wealth and narratively because of her interest in him as a boy, also probably assume to be responsible. Magwitch shows up almost exactly 2/3 of the way into the story as a whole, and for all that he has been called to mind several times through the course of the book, if the reader assumes that he's going to show up at all, the reader would also probably assume that he will be a specter of the past, a rectifying force of justice, perhaps a means of Pip paying for his crimes, or at least of assuaging, attenuating his own guilt. To bring him in as Pip's secret benefactor and to have Pip be so grateful to him that he will rapidly become the uncle figure that he pretends to be is itself a subversion of the reader's second-level expectations. In this way, Dickens is playing with the tendency of the Victorian novel to conserve detail, to neatly dovetail all the elements introduced, to unify all the strands of plot and character. And I've talked a little about the twists with which Dickens resolves this plot, and this, to be clear, I think, is not one of the bad ones. It takes a certain amount of investment of belief, but I think it's handled well enough that it plays out as a genuine reveal, particularly in the context of the Gothic frame bookending the scene. It makes sense of Jagger's behavior and his distancing of himself from his client. We'll get more of that in the pages to come. It even makes sense of Havisham's behavior, because this is just another way in which Pip can be put to use. We could spend hours, I'm sure, on this one scene, but time forces us onwards. Pip gets Magwitch settled in Herbert's room and then begins to reckon with the consequences of this revelation. Quote, "Miss Havisham's intentions toward me all a mere dream. Estella not designed for me. I only suffered in Satta's house as a convenience, a sting for the greedy relations, a model with a mechanical heart to practice on when no other practice was at hand. These were the first smarts I had. But sharpest and deepest pain of all, it was for the convict, guilty of I knew not what crimes, and liable to be taken out of those rooms where I sat thinking and hanged at the Old Bailey door that I had deserted Joe." And this, though it's concealed somewhat in the prose of the text, this is the turning point for Pip. For all that we've discussed his selfishness, his desire to rewrite his own narrative to account for his actions, his snobbish insecurity about his roots and the people who care most for him, ameliorated somewhat by his dedication to Herbert and the self-awareness with which he has been entangled with Estella, for all that he has been a difficult protagonist to side with always, this is the point at which he begins to take control of the narrative for the first time, explicitly, purposefully, generously, positively. He accepts the shamefulness of his actions, and he doesn't blame Magwitch for the manipulation any longer. When he's describing Magwitch as a figure who has committed these terrible crimes, who could be taken from this place, this safe place that he has built with Herbert, Magwitch could be taken and executed for those crimes, and it is for that man that Pip abandoned Joe. This is recognizing the imbalance at the heart of Pip's life. And we'll continue to see how he conducts himself now in the light of this knowledge as we move forward. Pip finally goes in to check on Magwitch and finds him asleep, armed with a pistol. He locks the door and quietly returns to the lounge where he sleeps away the rest of the night. This, we are told, is the end of the second stage of Pip's expectations. As I said, we're 2/3 of the way through the book now. We begin chapter 40 with Pip going out to get the light from the watchman and encountering a man on the stairs in the darkness, deepening this sense of dread, this sense that the world has been knocked off balance. Magwitch gives him the name Provis, which is connected by many readers of Great Expectations to Providence in the sense of both the plan for your life, but also, care and protection. I think it's also interesting as a contraction of proviso, the introduction of a conditional element in a contract, which is to say that Pip's future happiness and prosperity are conditional on the effective handling of Magwitch's current circumstances. I think interpretation can take you a long way in that space. We'll skip over the breakfast the following morning and Pip arranging the boarding house and the disguise for Provis before going to Jaggers, who gives us the best example in the whole book of his legalistic mind. I would quote the whole thing because, frankly, I find it delightful, particularly the repeated rhythmic emphasis of "in New South Wales." But we'll skip over that to get to the sequence where Pip is dressing Magwitch in his newly purchased clothing that ought to belong to Uncle Provis, only something innate to Magwitch makes the fine clothing fit him poorly. This is fascinating, particularly in the absence of an obvious point of comparison. Specifically, Pip himself is taken from the forge and clothed like a gentleman and is then immediately a gentleman. There doesn't seem to be any intended contrast here. We don't seem to be focusing on that disparity, and the lack is itself potentially interesting, particularly if, by inference, we're going to credit Pip with a more gentlemanly nature even as a child. That is, that his transformation is not as severe as Magwitch's, or that Magwitch, the convicted criminal, is of another sort entirely, somewhere beyond the event horizon of his criminality. This is also where we get the gesture toward Frankenstein that I noted earlier, though Pip inverts, as I say, that metaphor of creation that we've seen so far to identify himself as the impious student and Magwitch as the creature pursuing him. And here we might see an interesting conflation of Magwitch the man and the spectre of Pip's guilt and shame, this thing that has actually been haunting him, that has been changing his behavior, that has been driving him forward with this, impious self-regard. With the return of Herbert, though, Pip confronts his inability to accept any more of Magwitch's money now that he knows its provenance. And there is something happening here that I haven't been completely able to pin down. I hadn't really considered it before, and I will probably return to it in next week's episode. But between the consequences of Magwitch's reveal and the painstaking care with which Jaggers draws the line between what is known and what is not, there's something about the power of knowledge happening in this book. Estella knows what Havisham did to her. She is conscious of, mindful of every step of her manipulation, every step of her creation, but she is powerless to change it because she is what she is. She has been forged in exactly that way. Pip cannot now countenance the use of Magwitch's money because he has also become what he was intended to be. That is, a gentleman of nobility and decency and breeding and a preoccupation with the social hierarchy in which he is now playing his part. In epistemology, the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge, knowing something, quote unquote, is taken to be the holding of a justified true belief. That is, you believe that something is true, you have a reason for believing that that thing is true, and crucially, you are right. Only if those criteria are fulfilled can you truly say that you know something. Pip, for example, believed that Miss Havisham was his benefactor. He believed it. We might even say he was justified in the belief of it, but it was not ultimately true. Similarly, if you believe something that just happens to be true, but you don't have any direct justification, then you don't have knowledge, you just have a lucky guess. And there's something here happening about knowledge. There are things moving under the surface that relate to Dickens' take on epistemology, and I haven't quite figured it out yet. I don't think that I've quite unpicked it all. If you have thoughts, then please get in touch and let me know what you think about, Dickens' take on epistemology, on the nature of truth, on the power of truth, and how we can turn our backs to things which are suspected in this Jagersian sense, I suppose, turn our back on things which we know but are not acknowledging, right? Maintaining the veil of ignorance as a means of allowing certain behaviors that would be impossible in the full light of knowledge. This is interesting stuff. So if you have thoughts, get in touch. starsandswordspod@gmail.com. The upshot of this revelation, though, is, as we've noted, the transformation in Pip himself. Nowhere is this more evident than in his apparently sincere declaration, quote, "I would far rather have worked at the forge all the days of my life than I would ever have come to this," end quote. What a change there has been. From there, we move into chapter 42 and the extended account in Magwitch's voice, no less, of his personal history. He falls in with Compeyson, but when they are arrested, he is struck by the inequity of the law. He is sentenced to 14 years, but Compeyson is only sentenced to 7 because of his upbringing. More importantly, and certainly less plausibly, it turns out that Arthur is Miss Havisham's brother, and Compeyson is the man who left Havisham at the altar. Now this is where the coincidences start to spiral, and this is by no means the worst of the bunch. For a narrative that explicitly includes and encompasses the furthest reaches of the British Empire, New South Wales, the largest consequence of these contrivances is that the world feels tiny, as though it includes no more than a dozen locations and maybe 20 people in total. Again, I think that this comes in part from Dickens' desire to conserve detail, which is in line with that Victorian desire to be complete, and also to deliberately fold these mysteries together to present something of a puzzle box to the reader. It plays, too, with the inherent claustrophobia of the Gothic form. And there's some interesting bridging here that relies on the distinction between, and forgive me because we're venturing into Russian formalism here, on the distinction between plot and story. The plot, in this sense, in the Russian formalist sense, is the chronological series of events which occur in linear time. In Great Expectations, we would therefore begin somewhere around 1760 with the birth of Abel Magwitch. Then we would move through his life to the turn of the century when Magwitch meets Compeyson and Arthur Havisham, and that sad tale unfolds. And then he's arrested for passing forged currency, and Compeyson is sentenced to 7 years and Magwitch to double that, and then to the Christmas Eve churchyard in the marshes of Kent where he meets Pip, and so on and so on and so on through to the very end of the novel, which is the point at which we are the furthest downstream, chronologically speaking. And I don't mean just for this to encompass Magwitch's life as though he were the protagonist, but just that we start with him because he is presumably the oldest character. The plot, therefore, is every single event described in the course of the book in linear time, organized chronologically. That's contrasted with the concept of the story, which is the chronologically linear progression of events on the page rather than in abstracted phenomenological time. Thus, we would begin the story in the churchyard with Pip and Magwitch, and we'd progress from there, learning about the events of the past as we move forward, stitching those things together into the fabric of our understanding. What Dickens does structurally is to take two storylines which seem distinct in the story, seem separate from each other per the progression of the book, and then reveals that they were always knitted together in the plot. They were always branches of the same tree, according to his understanding. And there aren't, of course, just two. There are at least 4 major branches of this twisted, incestuous little web of coincidence and contrivance that we will talk about in due course. So all of this, we might consider, is abstractly effective storytelling. This is why these coincidences work when these coincidences work. This is why Lost works in particular, right? Demonstrating the ways in which these various plots are intertwined before the story itself begins. There's a satisfaction that comes with this kind of reveal, and to me, at least, it's something similar to the solving of a puzzle. It's a setting of the world to order. It's a way of apprehending this underlying all-encompassing truth, all of which are, of course, like catnip to the Victorian mind. Whether it works for you or not is partly, I think, a matter of taste, partly a matter of how well the book as a whole is working for you, how generous you're inclined to be, how willing you are to meet the book where it is, rather than comb through it like CinemaSins, scraping for flaws and inconsistencies. And now's as good a time as any, as reckless as I am with my own personal schedule, to remind you that there isn't a right or a wrong way to interact with fiction, with art, just an honest and a dishonest way. As the book exists in linear time, so do you, and this intersection of it and you won't ever happen again, which gives your authentic response from loving it to hating it and everything in between. It gives that response a unique value. We can strive for greater insight or for context or for understanding, but ultimately, it's you and the book and how you feel about it. And if you think at this point that Great Expectations is some contrived, puppeteered bullshit, well, I've got like an episode and a half left to convince you that there's maybe more happening than that, but I can't completely disagree with you. I can try to help you enjoy it a little more, but that's really the limit of my power as far as this podcast goes. Anyway, resolved to see Estella again before departing for the continent with Provis, a plan which he thinks will happen imminently by all accounts, Pip goes to Richmond, only to learn that Estella is back at Satis House. Pip then tells Provis that he has no choice but to go and visit Jo, which is an interestingly textured decision given his previous history with presenting the world as though he had no choice but to take action, but here it is avowedly fictionalized. Quote, "Next day I had the meanness to feign that I was under a binding promise to go down to Jo, but I was capable of almost any meanness toward Jo or his name." End quote. Pip acknowledging here his own selfishness. At the Blue Boar, he runs into Bentley Drummle, and we get this extended passive-aggressive contest between the two young men. The claustrophobia builds still further as Drummle departs, taking a light from the man in the inn yard who Pip suspects, and so do we, is Orlick. The walls are closing in, and nowhere is this more evident than in Pip's meeting with Havisham. The truth of his association with Havisham is revealed, not that any of it at this point is a surprise, and Pip exceeds expectations again by taking the time to commend Herbert and his father Matthew as being unlike the rest of Havisham's extended family. He asks Havisham to continue his work of anonymously securing Herbert's future, and then declares his love for Estella, but is also met with the cold, unyielding truth. Quote, "It seems," said Estella very calmly, "that there are sentiments, fancies, I don't know how to call them, which I am not able to comprehend. When you say you love me, I know what you mean as a form of words, but nothing more. You address nothing in my breast, you touch nothing there. I don't care for what you say at all. I have tried to warn you of this. Now, have I not?" End quote. Estella treating Pip with that same specific, unguarded honesty is perhaps her most compelling feature. Once again, Pip demonstrates how far he has now come by pleading with her, even knowing that she will not be with him, not to marry Drummle and to do simply better for herself, to which she gets the excellent retort, "Don't be afraid of my being a blessing to him." And then Pip gets his speech, perhaps the most capital R romantic moment in the entire book. What Pip himself describes as an ecstasy of unhappiness, that moment where the gothic heightening of mood and emotion resolves itself into this soaring operatic melodrama. It is, I think, impeccably written, and I'm obviously restraining myself from reading the entire thing, but what matters most, I think, is Pip's adult resolution to let her go, to remember instead only the good. This is not about the intensity of his love for her or any hope that they might have a life together, and certainly no right that he has over her by virtue of their long association. This is just the assurance that she has touched him, that the memory of her will not fade. She has become a part of him. Quote, "Part of the little good in me, part of the evil. But in this separation I associate you only with the good, and I will faithfully hold you to that always." End quote. This, more than anything, this choice to rise above his immediate emotional state, to deliberately adopt this more sanguine, generous, wise perspective, this proves that our Pip is finally coming into his expectations, not just as a gentleman, but as a man. This is followed by one of the hardest pivots in the entire book, honestly, as Pip leaves Satis House, resolves to walk the 25 miles back to London, and arrives after midnight, only to receive a note from Wemmick telling him not to go home. It won't surprise you to learn, I'm sure, that this is also a cliffhanger to entice the reader to return for the following week, particularly those readers who are either less interested in the romantic subplot or who are interested in that subplot so much that they may feel that they have received a certain resolution, a certain catharsis, and may not want to return. Instead, Dickens baits the hook with this sudden intrusion of clandestine messages and ominous warnings, which, as we will learn the following week in chapters 45 and 46, don't really amount to that much. Pip retreats to Hummums, a pair of real hotels in a corner of Covent Garden, which used to be Turkish baths. That is hammams, a name which evolves over time to the absolutely Dickensian Hummums. Pip passes a largely sleepless night and then sets off for Walworth to meet with Wemmick before he goes to the office and becomes intractable. Wemmick tells him in an excess of care and circuity that he overheard at Newgate that Magwitch has vanished from New South Wales, and now there is gossip about him returning to London. We learn that Herbert's young lady friend Clara lives with her father, who is a bedridden former purser who holds a good view of the river and the traffic that passes by. This house would be a discreet place to stash Magwitch for the duration, as well as a good staging area for his ultimate departure from England. We'll note here that Wemmick's repeated use of Tom, Jack, or Richard as an evasive means of referring to Magwitch, this is an altered form of the more traditional Tom, Dick, and Harry, although, interestingly, it obeys the underlying grammatical rule that applies to this type of construction in English, this particular kind of tricolon, as they are called, this single-syllable, double-syllable formulation. Tall, dark, and handsome. Lock, stock, and barrel, Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Wemmick's Tom, Jack, and Richard. It's that same form. And we might speculate that there's a subtle kind of joke happening here, that Wemmick, as precise as he is being, is deliberately changing the formulation to avoid the use of casual, informal nicknames. Dick being the familiar form of Richard, Harry as a familiar form of Henry. Jack here poses a bit of a problem, since in the England of the time it is generally a familiar form of John, though that's not exclusively true. It is possible, therefore, that Wemmick is successfully avoiding familiarity in his language as he is adopting this more formal tone, but it's also possible that Dickens is poking fun at him for not realizing that Jack falls into exactly the trap that he is so studiously avoiding by using the names Tom and Richard. Pip passes the day at the castle in the company of the aged P and leaves after dark. In the next chapter, we're introduced to the lovely Clara Barley and, by Herbert's account, to her father, the old Gruff and Grim. Pip's judgment of Clara as confiding and loving and innocent and modest, a captive fairy, as he says, in the employ of the old ogre, is selfless and astute, and though he doesn't mention Estella until the very end of the scene, we can be sure that he is thinking of her. This contrast is particularly striking, and certainly he's more capable now of seeing people clearly than he was back in the forge in the company of Biddy. Pip checks on Magwitch, and Herbert suggests that he and Pip take to the river more often, partly as a means of checking on Magwitch through an arranged signal, and to establish a pattern that will ultimately make it easier to get Magwitch out of the city. We conclude the chapter with Pip practicing his skills on the river, with weeks passing, and with Pip's sense of dread and pressure growing by the day. This continues into chapter 47, with money running out, the suspicion that Estella is already married to Drummle, and this constant anxiety. One day in February, Pip goes out on the water again and distracts himself from his troubles by going that evening to the theatre, where he sees Mr. Wopsle performing and looking stricken as if by some revelation, and it turns out that Compeyson was sitting behind Pip the whole time. And if it's implausible that Wopsle would recognize this man after what must now be 15 years, it is only a part of this rising claustrophobia that fuels this chapter and the next, which were, of course, published together in the serialized form. That connects us directly to the scene with Jaggers and Wemmick in the next chapter, wherein it is revealed, deep breath, you guys, that Molly, rescued from a murder charge by the particularly bullying and hectoring legalism of Jaggers, Molly is Estella's mother. The story itself is very strong, I think, and Wemmick's awestruck account of Jagger's skill in the courtroom is, I think, very fun, but we are once again struck by the interplay between Pip's feeling of increasing claustrophobia and the actual, literal compression of the world in terms of the cast of characters, the constriction of the bonds between them. And in fairness, because we love to love things, nobody in Dickens' audience is expecting realism. Literary realism is just beginning as a movement in the middle of the 19th century, and literary naturalism won't get started until Zola, 20 years after Dickens publishes Great Expectations. We should perhaps take this entire topic and pin it until next week's discussion, when we can really consider how the book plays its final hand and where we go from there. For now, let's move into chapter 49, and we are, I must admit, going to slow down the pace here to see how Dickens arrays arguably the most memorable and impactful set piece in the entire book. Pip returns to town the following day, stopping at the halfway house and walking the rest of the way, quote, "For I sought to get into the town quietly by the unfrequented ways and to leave it the same manner," end quote. This, we might infer, is to avoid the possibility of seeing Drummle again, though we might assume that Estella is now living with Drummle far from Satis house. That said, Estella visited Havisham regularly before, and there's no question that her loyalty to her adoptive mother would at least rival her loyalty to her new husband. At least, these are the implicit reasons for Pip's choice. The narrative reason is the growing, creeping sense of dread, the spectre of death. Quote, "The best light of the day was gone when I passed along the old echoing courts behind the high street. The nooks of ruin where the old monks had once had their refectories and gardens, and where the strong walls were now pressed into the service of humble sheds and stables, were almost as silent as the old monks in their graves. The cathedral chimes had at once a sadder and more remote sound to me as I hurried on, avoiding observation, than they had ever had before. So the swell of the old organ was borne to my ears like funeral music, and the rooks, as they hovered about the grey tower and swung in the bare high trees of the priory garden, seemed to call to me that the place was changed, and that Estella was gone out of it forever. End quote. Estella is gone. The world is grey and grim. But the monks in the grave, the cathedral chimes, the funeral music, the swinging in the bare high trees, Pip is thinking of Estella, but the world is thinking of death. This is again the pathetic fallacy. This is the externalization of the emotional landscape into the world and into the weather. The authors of the 19th century loved it. Indeed, the philosopher John Ruskin, had only named the pathetic fallacy in 1856, just 5 years before Great Expectations. So though it had been in common popular use within the English novel for more than a century, though it had been a common rhetorical and literary device, now it has been named. Now it is popular and modern and present, just as Dickens is writing Great Expectations. In Ruskin's original essay, he writes, initially quoting Alton Locke, quote, "They rowed her in across the rolling foam, the cruel, crawling foam." And Ruskin notes, "The foam is not cruel, neither does it crawl. The state of mind which attributes to it these characters of a living creature is one in which the reason is unhinged by grief. All violent feelings have the same effect. They produce in us a falseness in all our impressions of external things, which I would generally characterize as the pathetic fallacy." That is, we are, in our apprehension of the world, as we move through the world in real life, we are externalizing our own emotional interiority into the things that we see and apprehend, particularly those chaotic systems which seem so far beyond immediate and strict understanding as to yield this kind of emergent behavior, these emergent qualities of emotion. And of course, as readers, we are dependent on the author to do that legwork for us, because we can't read into these things which we have no means of experiencing except through their authorial description. And that's true, of course, throughout the book. We can think of the mists on the marshes. We can think of the ominous storm that blows through earlier in today's reading as Magwitch appears in London. And we will get at least one more great positive example much later in the book. This, for me, is the best example of this fallacy, though, because it's working against Pip's own understanding of his feelings, his own accounting. It introduces a supernatural element. We are sensing the future, and we'll sense the future all the more acutely and directly in the pages to come. Even the lone candle that Pip carries into Satis house, the ashy fire in front of Havisham, the whole book now is ringing like a funereal bell. Pip begins explaining the situation with Herbert, but realizes quickly that Havisham has lost her focus and is merely studying him. And when she rouses, she returns to an attitude of fear, of judgment, of, we might speculate, a kind of shame. She has been overturned somehow in her poise. Let's take a moment to observe this Pip, this young gentleman who has so set aside the chip on his shoulder that he is now demonstrating not just impeccable courtesy, but an actual kindness, an actual selflessness that we wouldn't have associated with him earlier in the book. He tells Havisham the plain truth as far as he can without divulging Magwitch's secret, which he even acknowledges is a secret and not his to tell. And when Havisham extends herself further, he receives it with grace. Quote, "Can I only serve you, Pip, by serving your friend? Regarding that as done, is there nothing I can do for you yourself?" "Nothing. I thank you for the question. I thank you even more for the tone of the question. But there is nothing." End quote. And then, as she tremulously, indirectly asks for his forgiveness, unable to face the reality of this desire, this need, this want, she cannot ask for it clearly, but she can give him a means of expressing it indirectly. He doesn't take it. He expresses it absolutely directly. Quote, "My name is on the first leaf. If you can ever write under my name, I forgive her, though ever so long after my broken heart is dust. Pray do it." "Oh, Miss Havisham," said I can do it now. There have been sore mistakes, and my life has been a blind and thankless one, and I want forgiveness and direction far too much to be bitter with you." End quote. This is wisdom. This is self-awareness. This is generosity. Havisham is struck by the grief of forgiveness, the excess of feeling that remains dammed up behind conflict and enmity and can be freed only in that moment of forgiveness. And Pip reflects on her sins. Yes, she crafted Estella as a tool of her vengeance, but the real harm that was done came from sealing herself away from the 1,000 natural and healing influences, as he says. By preventing the passage of time, she excluded the possibility of healing. She was sustained only by her self-pity and pain and desire for vengeance and hurt. And of course, as is always the case, no one suffers for the pursuit of vengeance more than the architect of that vengeance. No one suffers more from anger than the person who chooses to hold it in their heart. Dickens offers a theory here of mental illness, which doesn't, of course, match to our modern understanding of actual mental illness, but which is undeniably melodramatically, poetically effective, which echoes the themes of creation through the book. Quote, "Her mind, brooding solitary, had grown diseased as all minds do and must and will that reverse the appointed order of their maker." End quote. That capital M, maker, distinguishes the creative power of God from the sub-creative power, where did I put that Tolkien jar, of Havisham and Magwitch, both of whom have turned to a kind of ruin, curdled into self-regard. And so we get to the moment of truth. It was Pip's impassioned declaration of love for Estella that reminded Havisham of what she used to feel, of what is, objectively, outside of the bounds of Satis House, true. And Pip, valiant as he is now, takes this moment. Quote, "Miss Havisham," I said when her cry had died away, "you may dismiss me from your mind and conscience, but Estella is a different case, and if you can ever undo any scrap of what you have done amiss in keeping a part of her right nature away from her, it will be better to do that than to bemoan the past through 100 years. End quote. Havisham tells Pip about the circumstances of Estella's arrival in her household. She was 2 or 3 years old, and neither had any knowledge of Estella's mother. Dickens confirms that Molly is undoubtedly the mother in question, really doubling down on that, as Pip says, quote, "The connection here was clear and straight." Not quite how I would describe that connection, but sure, okay. And then, all at once, everything that can be said has been said, and Pip departs. Quote, "Twilight was closing in when I went downstairs to the natural air. I called to the woman who had opened the gate when I entered that I would not trouble her just yet, but I would walk round the place before leaving, for I had a presentiment that I should never be there again, and I felt that the dying light was suited to my last view of it." End quote. Now this presentiment is a little complex, as we'll see, but it's an undeniable moment of parting. Pip is already feeling this twilight, the dying light. We are returning to, well, a spectre of death, the same spectre of death with which we began this chapter. Pip completes his tour of the grounds, revisiting the place where he fought with Herbert, the paths he walked with Estella, and then he has a vision of Miss Havisham hanging from a beam. So struck by this is he, so struck by this supernatural vision, that he returns upstairs to see her, and when he does, he sees her consumed by flames from the ashy fire. And we don't often get to do this kind of close reading in Dickens, so let's look at this sequence of events, because I think it yields a great understanding of what Dickens is moving toward as the book winds down. Everything that needs to be said between Pip and Havisham has suddenly been said. So Pip departs, but in his leaving of the building, he is connected back to the natural world and to the sentimental memories which are anchored throughout this garden. Herbert, his dearest friend, Estella, the woman he loves. And you'll note, too, how he returns to the location where he fought Herbert way back in the beginning of the book, but we get no mention of the kiss that followed thereafter, which was arguably, at least perhaps, the last time that Estella felt the rise of genuine passion within her breast. Then the vision accosts him, and still he hesitates. And if any of those things hadn't happened, if Pip hadn't been connected to the world and to memory both outside of the walls of the house but still bounded by the garden, then he would have left before anything happened. If Pip hadn't been connected enough to the present and to the supernatural that he had this vision, he wouldn't have returned to Havisham's room. There is, if not an order, if not a eucatastrophe, there is something beneficial springing from the way that Pip, healed and whole in this instance, moves through the world. He conducts himself with a sentimentality, but also a prudence, a wisdom that is deep within him now, and that yields, well, what we might interpret as a positive, a beneficial aspect, because it is Pip's intervention smothering the fire with his coat upon his return to Miss Havisham amidst the fleeing spiders and beetles that prolongs her life and gives her a small opportunity to do some good, to undo some of her harm before she dies. And thus, we arrive at one of the great unanswered questions in all of literature. What happened to Miss Havisham? Is it a terrible accident? Did she take her own life? Is it divine retribution? Is it some kind of justice? Well, it's impossible to say, of course. And if we're going to do some close reading, we should be mindful of the space between the assumptions that we might make and the assumptions of the contemporary audience. And certainly to try to give space to interpret Dickens' intent. I'm thinking in particular of the image of the hanged Miss Havisham outside, which was much more likely to read to the contemporary audience as an execution rather than a suicide. And honestly, I'm disinclined to delve too deeply into it, except, I think, to say this. The emphasis put on the ashy fire suggests to me that we are not supposed to read this conflagration as a simple accident. This is no bright, roaring, crackling, violent fire. It's more of a sulky smolder. That doesn't speak to Havisham's intent or to further supernatural or divine interventions, but it removes for me what I take to be the least likely and certainly the least compelling of the three explanations, and what remains, well, is important. There's something so haunting about Miss Havisham repeating the three phrases over and over, oblivious even to Pip's farewell. It calls to mind, and forgive me, extremely minor spoilers for the end of the second season of Twin Peaks here, I guess, but it calls to mind the repeated phrase, "How's Annie?" at the end of that show, and crucially, the addendum that we get in the 2017 book Twin Peaks: The Final Dossier, which is Mark Frost's largely successful attempt to stitch together the various mythological strands of that story, in which we learn that Annie has been institutionalized since the events of the second season, and she does not speak, except for once every year at a very specific time, when she simply says out loud to an audience of no one, "I'm fine." Twin Peaks podcast, coming just as soon as I have the time to make a Twin Peaks podcast, I guess. Let's conclude then with this very brief chapter 50, in which the extent of Pip's burns are made clear. Herbert cares for him in a very loving and gentle fashion, which I just adore. And Herbert also tells him that Magwitch has disclosed more of his personal history, specifically the story of the woman with whom he had trouble. We are parsing this in pieces as Herbert tells the story, so let's here just skip to the end. Molly was the means by which Magwitch learned about Jaggers, because Magwitch and Molly were a couple, and Magwitch, with grim inevitability, is revealed as Estella's father. And maybe I'm just numb now. Maybe it's because we've already run so long in this week's episode, but I have at this point little to offer except a resigned and exhausted, okay, if you like. It is in some ways the inevitable resting place of this unfolding plot. By the time that we draw Molly into the mix, it is almost more likely that Magwitch is Estella's dad than not. If not him, then it's a process of elimination. It must be the aged P, or it must be Clara's gruff and grim father hiding away on the banks of the river. We will circle back to Estella's parentage and its obvious ironic implication for Pip's own sense of himself and his status in the world in next week's reading, when we finish Great Expectations. We're going to talk next week about the original ending to the novel, which Dickens was persuaded to change prior to publication by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, his friend. The change is relatively minor, but it does a great deal, I think, to turn the overall effect of the book into something more hopeful, more classically romantic, and arguably more satisfying. I will leave a link in the show notes to what we have of the original ending, just in case you are interested to do a little compare and contrast. But if you are reading a copy of Great Expectations today, rest assured you have the revised ending. This is what it was supposed to be by Dickens' own hand. That will do it for this week's episode. Next week, the end of Great Expectations and, of course, some closing thoughts. My schedule is evidently still something of a mess. It was perhaps ambitious, perhaps naive, to undertake a book of this length and complexity in so few episodes. So we will rectify that moving forward into our next miniseries as we look at our BIPOC Visions of the Future unit, which will come along in just a couple of weeks, accompanied by a very exciting poll for our end of the summer project, which I cannot wait to get to and cannot wait to discuss with you. If you would like to support me in this ongoing effort to footnote all of genre fiction, I mean, let's be honest, that's what we're doing here. Every single book will eventually be footnoted to death. If you would like to support me in this ongoing effort, then please consider heading over to patreon.com/nextword. Your support makes a huge difference. You can get a bushelful of bonus episodes over there and a link to the private Next Word Discord, where you will find a collection of the smartest, kindest, best people. It's a really great place to hang out and talk about the books, the stories, the television, the movies that we all love. That's the show. Until next time, quote, "The stones of which the strongest London buildings are made are not more real or more impossible to be displaced by your hands than your presence and influence have been to me, there and everywhere, and will be." End quote. Thanks for listening.